Suggests that it's more that the Conservatives lost the confidence of the public than the Labour Party.
Keir Starmer just took a sledgehammer to CNN News, calling them out for pushing biased agendas and being out of touch with everyday people. It's the kind of fiery speech that's got everyone talking, and not just Conservatives. He's even hinting at defunding them. But here's the real question. Is Starmer onto something, or is he just stirring the pot?
But I do wonder, in terms of the massive economic and infrastructure problems, not just physical infrastructure, but government infrastructure.
So Keir Starmer didn't hold back at all in his takedown of CNN News. He's accusing them of some pretty serious stuff, mainly that they're incredibly biased and basically serve as a mouthpiece for a particular political agenda. According to Starmer, CNN isn't just delivering news, they're actively promoting a worldview that he believes aligns with US liberals and what he calls the establishment. It's like he's calling out CNN for wearing their political biases on their sleeve and only telling one side of the story.
To fix everything that's wrong in the UK and improve people's lives.
Well, let me address both of those questions, because I took over the Labour Party 4.5 years ago. We'd just had the worst general election result since 1935.
Starmer's been on this path for a while now, so his criticism of the media isn't anything new. He's repeatedly argued that media outlets like CNN are guilty of manipulating the narrative, pushing misinformation, and neglecting balanced reporting. Essentially, he feels that they're cherry-picking facts and stories that fit their preferred storyline, rather than giving viewers the full picture. I mean, he's gone as far as to say that CNN is less interested in honest reporting and more about shaping public opinion in a way that serves their interests. In his latest rant, Starmer pointed to specific examples of CNN's reporting that he found particularly egregious. For instance, he highlighted a recent piece where CNN focused on the perceived flaws of Conservative policies, all while glossing over similar issues within liberal ones. According to him, this selective focus is a pattern for CNN. They're more than willing to dig into the faults of Conservatives, but when it comes to scrutinising liberals, it's like they put on blinders. And then there was that coverage on the US elections. Starmer believes CNN showed an obvious bias in their analysis, using language that painted certain candidates in a positive light while subtly undermining others. He's calling out this kind of reporting as the exact reason why people are losing trust in mainstream media.
We've got to be steely, we're going to change the Labour Party, we're going to turn it inside out and make sure it's a party that always says country first and party second.
He's not just talking about CNN's bias. He's also throwing down some pretty radical ideas about defunding or massively reforming the network. Basically, he argues that CNN has become nothing more than a tool for promoting specific political agendas. So why should they continue to operate in their current form? According to him, CNN's cozy relationship with the establishment makes them incapable of providing the kind of objective, reliable journalism that people actually want. So what's Starmer's solution? Well, he's proposing to cut funding, or at the very least, push for a total overhaul. He wants CNN to be held accountable for its actions and to start delivering news that represents all sides fairly. In his mind, CNN is out of touch with the average viewer, more focused on pleasing a narrow set of elites than actually serving the public. To him, the network's priorities are backward, and he believes a shake-up is long overdue.
Been falling apart, but we've seen plenty of examples in history where a Conservative government has been failing and yet a Labour government hasn't been elected, and it was only by changing the Labour Party.
Starmer's argument goes beyond just CNN being biased. He's painting them as part of a broader problem within the media landscape. He feels that CNN is so entangled with the establishment that they've lost any sense of independence. He even hinted that CNN's reporting choices are driven by a desire to maintain good relationships with the powerful, rather than an obligation to tell the truth. To put it simply, he sees CNN as an echo chamber for elite opinions, completely disconnected from the real concerns of everyday people. For Starmer, defunding or reforming CNN isn't just about saving money, it's about taking a stand for what he views as fairer, more responsible journalism. Of course, CNN didn't just sit quietly while Starmer went off on them. they fired back almost immediately, with representatives from the network and several political figures accusing him of engaging in extremist rhetoric. They've basically said that Starmer's criticisms are overblown and that he's just trying to stir the pot. CNN's main defense is that they're simply doing their job, providing news coverage and countering misinformation. They argue that it's not their job to pander to any political ideology, but rather to hold those in power accountable, regardless of their affiliations.
To persuade the electorate to elect us into government, and with a very powerful and strong mandate. We won in parts of the countries.
Several politicians have also chimed in, either backing up CNN or taking Starmer's side. Unsurprisingly, a lot of liberals and establishment types are rallying behind CNN. They've accused Starmer of trying to silence dissenting voices and attempting to dismantle an institution that plays a critical role in informing the public. On the flip side, there are a fair number of people who feel like Starmer has a point. Even some centrist figures are saying that CNN might be overdue for some reform, and that their coverage does sometimes come off as one-sided. In their response, CNN also brought up the role of public broadcasters, emphasizing that they're essential in an age where misinformation is rampant. They've pointed to the idea that public media outlets need to be there to provide reliable, factual information, especially when private media can be so profit-driven and sensationalist. CNN's reps have argued that they're committed to delivering unbiased news, even if people like Starmer see it differently. They're essentially saying, look, we're here to serve the public, and we're doing the best we can. This whole situation has sparked a massive debate about what role media should play in society. Some people are arguing that public broadcasters like CNN are more interested in pushing certain narratives than actually reporting the news. They feel that CNN's criticisms of Starmer are more about protecting their own interests than actually addressing his concerns. And then there's the argument that maybe we're putting too much trust in a single source of news. After all, having multiple perspectives is crucial for a healthy democracy, right?
Conservative MP for 100 years. Now, in relation to the second part of your question on the economy, it has been broken. We haven't had economic growth for 14 years.
It's actually a huge deal when you think about it, especially in today's digital world where everyone's glued to their phones and bombarded with content from all sides. Publicly funded media outlets like CNN, BBC and CBC were originally meant to provide an unbiased, reliable source of information for the masses. The idea was simple: make sure people have access to honest news without being overly influenced by corporate or political interests. Sounds good in theory, right? But here's where it gets messy. With all these streaming services and independent news sources popping up, public broadcasters are facing tough competition. Some folks, including Starmer, feel like these traditional outlets aren't adapting fast enough. According to Starmer, public broadcasters often end up as echo chambers for certain political agendas. He's a big fan of private, independent outlets, saying they're more in touch with what people actually care about and less likely to be swayed by government influence.
Our Chancellor has been out days after the election taking tough decisions on planning, on infrastructure, setting up the sort of bodies, the National Wealth Fund that we will need.
Now, when it comes to the argument over defunding public broadcasters, you've got strong opinions on both sides. Starmer and his supporters argue that pulling the plug on public broadcasters would free up taxpayer money and allow more independent voices to thrive. They're concerned that public broadcasters, with all their funding, can get a bit too comfortable and end up pushing a one-sided narrative. On the other hand, defenders of public broadcasters point out that these outlets are essential for underserved communities, like rural and minority populations, who might not have access to other reliable sources of news. For example, the CBC in Canada provides news in Indigenous languages, which is a lifeline for certain communities. So if we start defunding these outlets, are we putting those communities at risk? Starmer would argue that other media could step in and fill the gap, but critics say it's not that simple. Private media outlets are driven by profit, which might not lead them to prioritize rural or minority issues. It's a complex debate, and one where both sides raise pretty valid points. Here's where Starmer is really trying to make his mark. He's not just calling for CNN to lose funding or get downsized, he's also demanding some serious accountability. In his view, a publicly funded media outlet should be totally transparent about where its money is going and how it's being used. He thinks it's high time for a major overhaul in terms of oversight. He's pushing for funding models that aren't reliant on government subsidies, because he believes that those subsidies can be used as leverage to control what gets reported.
But our number one mission, if you like, the driving purpose of this government is going to be economic growth measured in living standards rate.
One of his big proposals is for media outlets to shift to a more private funding model. He thinks that would reduce the risk of bias, as they wouldn't have to worry about appeasing government officials to keep their budgets intact. Starmer argues that the media should serve the public interest, not the interests of politicians or corporate giants. And in his ideal world, there'd be a lot more transparency around this. He wants clear, open records showing exactly how funds are allocated, so the public can see if there's any funny business going on. Another thing he's pushing for is increased oversight. Starmer believes that with tighter regulations and more external audits, publicly funded media would be less likely to stray into biased reporting. He's looking at ways to make sure these outlets are held to account, not just by the government, but also by independent watchdogs. It's all about building trust and making sure the public can rely on these sources without wondering if there's a hidden agenda. As you can imagine, Starmer's stance has sparked quite a bit of conversation. On one hand, you've got a lot of conservatives and folks who are skeptical of mainstream media jumping on board with his ideas. They're thrilled to see someone finally calling out CNN and pushing for a shake-up. Social media is flooded with people saying things like, "Finally, someone with the guts to tell it like it is," and "About time we had some accountability in the media."
I'm really glad that we've hit the ground running on that.
When the UK voted to leave the European Union in 2016, a move you campaigned against at the time,
Yes,
we
it did.
should note.
But it's not all cheers and applause. There's also a significant crowd that's pretty concerned about where this could lead. Some people are worried that defunding public broadcasters like CNN could open the door for misinformation to spread even faster. Without a reliable source that's widely accessible, they fear people will turn to less credible outlets. And as expected, there's been pushback from more liberal viewers who feel that Starmer is just trying to silence a voice that often challenges conservative views. It's interesting to see the divide, especially since it's not strictly a left-right issue. Some centrists and even a few liberals have chimed in, saying they're actually open to the idea of reforming CNN. They agree that there's room for improvement and that public broadcasters should be held accountable, but they stop short of calling for full defunding. They're more focused on reforms that would make public broadcasters more balanced, rather than taking drastic steps to dismantle them. The ripple effects of Starmer's stance are worth considering too. If he manages to rally enough support, this could lead to some pretty big shifts in media-government relations. For one, public broadcasters would likely come under a lot more scrutiny, especially if other politicians decide to follow Starmer's lead. We might see more calls for transparency and accountability, not just from CNN, but from other publicly funded outlets as well.
Many of the UK's allies thought it was as if the Brits were stepping off the world stage. Now, you have ruled out a vote to un-Brexit, to rejoin.
For CNN and similar networks, this could mean a real shift in how they operate. If public demand for reform keeps growing, they might have to rethink their funding models and reporting strategies. In a worst-case scenario, they could lose a chunk of their funding, which would force them to downsize or find alternative revenue streams. It would definitely be a big wake-up call for the entire industry. And then there's the broader impact on public perception of journalism. Starmer's criticism could lead to more people questioning the credibility of mainstream media, and that's not something to take lightly. If people start to lose faith in these outlets, it could open the door for smaller, independent media to step up and fill the void. That might lead to a more diverse media landscape, but it could also mean less consistency in terms of standards and reliability. Overall, Starmer's stance isn't just a one-off attack on CNN, it's part of a much larger conversation about the future of media and how it should be funded and regulated. And whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying that he's tapped into a nerve. People are paying attention, and it'll be fascinating to see how this debate unfolds in the coming months.